Welcome back to another episode of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm your host, Susie Selleck, here today in Middletown, Indiana. We're here at the Historical Society, and I'm joined by Bob Hess. Bob, thank you so much for having us out here.
And I certainly appreciate you people being here, interested in our small town.
I am interested in your small town. Our viewers are interested in the town. So let's just get started. Give us a general overview of the history of Middletown.
Middletown, like most small towns west of Virginia, got here by Ohio River, coming up through the southern part of Indiana. And after the town of Anderson and Newcastle were established, trying to transport between the two through the trails that the Indians had established and the livestock and deer and whatever, bears. They made a path across Fall Creek down here, and I think what happened, what do we would call it? And they just said, well, it's the middle of Newcastle and Anderson, and that's more or less, we'll just call it Middletown. And it's on the banks of Fall Creek, which leads all the way to the city of Indianapolis, and a lot of history along the route. But one of the first settlers settled north of town where the bears were, and one of the last Indians left, and saying farewell to them. A few more came in, but a name of Jacob Coons was one of the first one in the city limits. He lived up here on 6th Street as we know it now, but when they graded the new streets, they moved him to a cemetery south of Middletown. We call it the South Cemetery. And because Chauncey Burr owned part of it, who was the gentleman that got Middletown incorporated around 1840 and became our Chief Justice, or Justice of Peace, you want to call it, for many years, they had a big auction in around 1829 downtown on Christmas Day, and they auctioned off lots right here on this street, Locust Street and 5th, which led to new developments, new homes, and that eventually developed. The first businessman came from Mechanicsburg. He was into grains and sold corn and beans and so forth, but he built the first brick building downtown Middletown on the corner, southwest corner of 5th and Locust. And a few years after him, a gentleman by Nimrod Elliott, his dad had a general store in Mechanicsburg. But Nimrod decided to come to Middletown, but you couldn't hardly get to Middletown because there were hardly any roads. And so he started what they called toll roads. And of course the farmers along the routes would help grade the roads and whatever. So they would set up gates. And one gate was down here where Shenandoah School is now. We call it Raider Road, but that was called College Corner back in those years. And there was a gate there. And you would have to pay a quarter or 50 cents, whatever. Don't know what the numbers were, but to get to Middletown. And then there was another gate just south of Middletown, and it belonged to Nathan Riley. And there was an inn there on the curve just south of Middletown. Most of us knew that, but it's been tore down since then. And you had to pay there to get on in. And there was a toll road that went east, and another one we called Buckeye Pike, which is what we now call South 8th Street. And over the years, there was like 8 different cemeteries in Fall Creek Township. We now have 2 of the largest privately owned. They're not supported by taxpayers, and it's Miller Cemetery, which are a lot of your Civil War people from both sides are buried out there. And Madison County Historical Society has done a few stories on that through Steve Jackson, and he's got a lot of recordings of that. And the other one is the Mechanicsburg Cemetery. And Nimrod Elliott was buried in Mechanicsburg Cemetery, but when he got to Middletown, him and his friend, who helped start the history of Henry County and wrote a lot of the Henry County history books, they started the first bank in downtown Middletown. And then they went to Anderson and started another bank. And his friend went on to run for the State House. So Nimrod came back to Middletown and started another bank.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask, Bob. What are some of the other businesses that were started kind of early in Middletown?
Most of them very early were general store. One of them was, I think, right here across the street. Again, we have the names recorded, but it's interesting to know that this intersection down here is where most of them became. And Captain Tykel, who had fought in the Spanish-American War, built one of the brick buildings down here, and then he kept adding on to it. So he owned several of the brick buildings down here as we expanded on west. And Dr. Summers had a big fancy brick house across the street, and later built buildings on west of us.
Now, I'm curious, is one of those, because Hess Insurance is a business that's still around today, correct? That would have come
Yes.
a little bit later, but did that business occupy one of those buildings that was built back then?
It occupied a home right here. Thank you for asking. It was a wooden home, and he had one of the first funeral homes in it that he had bought from Captain Tykel. And Captain Tykel had two sons, George Tykel, or a son, and then a grandson by George Tykel. And they built the big brick house north of there. But Showalter bought his funeral equipment and started a small parlor, and he had one of the first horse-drawn hearses in town, which we have photos of, and then he had the first mechanized hearse in Middletown, about in 1927, I think it was, and it's parked out here on Locust Street. But the funny thing about that is one of his employees went on to work for another funeral home, and many years later, when he died, George Ballard from Newcastle moved to town working for him, and now George Ballard has his son right over here, Ballard Funeral Homes, another business.
Yep.
But it all rotated from W.N. Showalter, who also had a furniture store. He made furniture, and that's what he mainly sold, and he got into the camera business, and actually had one of the first cameras in the area.
Bob, is that the camera that you and I were looking at earlier?
Thank you. I'm guessing about 1870 or 80. It's red cherry wood with leather, and folds out, tripod. Being a furniture man, he made his own drawers. We have his glass slides and glass negatives, and he would show these pictures with his projector. We have one of them on the side of some of the buildings, and one of them was the Teichelbach building, one of the tallest one downtown, like on Saturday night, and this was way before TV, and
Yeah.
probably had some refreshments and popcorn, and that was about it. But that's what entertained Middletown. He had also across the street one of the Nickelodeon theaters. He had one of the first ones, and the automobiles, he also owned one of the first automobiles in Henry County. It was a 1901 Locmobile, and his daughter had married John Hedrick, and John Hedrick had built some of these brick buildings right down here that we knew as Faley's Tavern for many years.
Yep.
And he built one of the first homes up on the corner, in the northwest corner of 5th and High, and the Remy brothers that helped get General Motors going, wired it through the Welch Hotel, which Miss Anna Welch came from the state of Washington, and built a hotel and put an electric plant in it right behind her hotel. And a lot of people don't know it, but the building is part of what we knew as the Dietrich Chevrolet, and it's still standing. So when the town saw her electric plant,
Yeah.
they contracted from her this first street lights of downtown Middletown, and this was all around the year 1900.
Okay.
And had brick streets. The first railroad came through Middletown in 1856 from Anderson to Newcastle,
Yeah.
and on to Richmond. The interurban came through in 1805, and it stopped right here in front of Showalter's home, and we have pictures of it welcoming him to Middletown. At the same time, this merchant building across the street was finished, 1805, I believe. And it came from Anderson through Mound State Park, but it never made it to any further than Middletown. And it had a turnaround down here in the park, which we have photos of. And like I say, it was an interurban track in a brick street. And we always referred to it as our buggy parking lot down there, because when you came to town, you parked your buggies down there across from where Miracle Tool is now. And then you visited with the town. My teacher was one of them. She told me she used to bring her horse and buggy there, and she'd go to teach school, and when she went home, she'd get back in her horse and buggy, go to east of town. Like I said, I don't know where our first doctors and dentists, one of our first doctors lived right here where we sit.
Really?
Dr. Waters.
Okay.
He came to Middletown by railroad, and the train broke down east of town. He had to walk into town. He thought, well, that's a nice little town. He stayed here, and they named a park right up here on 5th Street, and it's still got a plaque in a rock there. Nobody understands it, but it says Waters Park. It had a tennis court and a croquet court,
Yeah.
and a little fishing pond. We have pictures of it, and that led to other parks along the road. Dietrich Park came along. That was Bud Dietrich. His dad had a Chevrolet garage, and he dreamed of a park down here on Fall Creek, and so it's about 23 acres.
Bob, can you talk to me about what are some of the, you are talking a lot about some of that early history, which is great. But what about some of the community things that happen? We can even talk about, as history has recorded, some of the community events that have kind of like built the town up. But then even when we were talking earlier, there's been a fair here recently. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about that as well.
Thank you for asking that question, because back to Nimrod Elliott,
okay,
who came from Mechanicsburg. Not only did he had to tear down the Franklin brick building.
Yeah.
He had built a bank over here next to Ballard's funeral home, and it's a flower shop now. But it was Farmers Bank. But every 20 years you have to change your legal establishment, and they named it the Farmers State Bank.
Okay.
So they built a new building. We call it the new building down here now that stands, but it's empty. But it became Farmers State Bank for years. But in that process, being a banker and everything, he went out northwest of Middletown here and started a fairgrounds, which had a harness racetrack. And that became not only Henry, but Madison and Delaware counties' big thing every year. And now Anderson has a racetrack, but we had one of the first back then.
Very nice.
And he built the Elliott Opera House down here across from our city building.
Yeah, you said that sits like, or did sit 600
it
some
held 600
seats?
people. It was like a 2-story building, and the Middletown News was located in the front of it, and the Chicago restaurant was in it.
Oh.
And there's very few pictures of it. I have 3 or 4 that he probably shot. They built it back in the 1880s, and they tore it down by, I think it was by 1913 it was tore down. Or
really?
At that time.
Okay.
But yeah, it's amazing. So
that was one of the popular places, obviously, to go. Okay,
fair,
well,
but the fair, that's the reason why they call they later built a school there, and they call it Fairfield School, and that's the reason why a lot of people don't realize that.
Gotcha.
And they played independent football there and independent baseball, and that was a big deal. And we have pictures of that fairground.
Okay. Now, once let's kind of like walk the history forward a little bit. What other things were there at the time that the people in the town did, that the community really kind of gathered around to make it, I would say the strength of the community, because it sounds like that's been alive and well since the beginning.
As time goes, and now we're getting into my time, because I remember back in like 1950s,
Yep.
The Middletown Chamber of Commerce had helped establish this park down here, but in order to do that, they would have rodeos every year. And my dad was into horses. He was raised on a horse farm south of town, and so he became our unofficial, and I still have his Santa Claus suit. And he had a sleigh. He had 4 or 5 teardrop sleighs. He had a white horse called Old Bill, and I've got too many stories about that, but he would park right here in front of his office downtown with his Santa Claus. I'd have to hold the horse, but back to what we did, we had rodeos during the summer, which helped the Chamber of Commerce raise money for that. And then they had street fairs. And the street fairs are right here where you and I talk. And I can remember the merry-go-round being right over here on this corner. And the Ferris wheel was right down here in the street. And the marching band would come down this street this way and turn up and go up 6th Street Hill. We have movies of it back in the 40s. Shot by Ed Jones and Frank Dietrich. Which also leads me to, we had a mill down here on 8th and Locust, and it burnt in 45 or 6.
Okay.
The biggest fire we ever had.
Right.
Anderson Fire Department came over to fight it. My uncle Ed Jones shot a movie of it, and Frank Dietrich, the local Chevrolet dealer, had 1939 8mm Kodak cameras, and it's on film, and we duplicate it, and we put descriptions on that.
Right.
And there was, that's the volunteer fire department. By the way, got organized on June the 12th, 1896, and that was organized by W.N. Showalter as chief, and my grandfather Raymond Hess happened to be one of the first volunteer firemen, and he was the secretary of it. And all they had at that time was a hand-pulled hose cart, which we still have.
Oh, really?
And when I was a young boy, it sat out here in the back by a blacksmith shop on the corner.
Yeah.
And in later years, when I got out of college and I was in the volunteer fire department, it was in pieces on top of our portable jail, which I still wish we had, which is in our former city building on the northeast corner, Locust and Fifth. But anyway, we got that and restored it, and it's in here. So they wanted horses back in those days, but the first mechanized fire truck they got was a 26, I think, Seagraves. And Raymond Hess, again, my grandfather, happened to be the clerk treasurer of the town of Middletown when he wrote the check, $5,000 for that truck, and we still have the check and the paperwork, and I only wish we had the truck.
Yeah, that would be nice.
That leads to other stories as to how it became a fire department.
Well, here's an interesting thing. I've been in the Historical Society now. There are some incredibly unique pieces in there of history that have been preserved and preserved really well. One of the things that I would love for you to touch on is the fact that, the library didn't want some of these things, but the genealogy collection that you have in there is like really impressive. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so again, appreciate you asking, because if you don't ask, we don't get there, right?
Yeah, right.
I've asked people to ask more questions.
Yeah.
Because, and to get there, I didn't have any interest in this until it just fell in my lap, and what do you do with this?
Yeah, exactly.
And so my aunt happened to be Martha Jones. She was a librarian for 52 years.
Oh, wow.
And she was interested in genealogy. She had married my uncle, Ed Jones. And so she was always pushing us to do this. And when she retired, the new library really didn't have any interest in genealogy. So when we established this in 1987, that was one of the first things our bylaws and the people wanted was the genealogy. So we're still working on that. But where was I going to go? I now forgot where I was going to go on.
No, the fact that you guys have got the collection and what you're really the capabilities that it has now, because that's like one of the big things that people search on the internet is like, where am I from and who is my family and where did we get our name and who else am I related to? It seems like you have a strong presence of those answers inside the Historical Society.
In 1953, the gentleman I just talked about, Ed Jones, died of cancer at his home, and that was Martha's husband, and he had 8mm cameras and equipment. So I was the young guy at that time, like the young people on the internet today.
Yes.
And they wanted to see these films on Saturday night. They didn't have TVs.
Yeah.
So I was the young guy that had to show them on the projectors. Well, there was all these 50mm little reels, and I inherited his editing machine, little thing, and my doctor lived next door, and he had one, so he gave me one on Super 8mm. So the next thing I know, I was editing all ththese films and putting them on 200-foot reels, and then I would put music to it or edit it with sound later, and it became VHS, Super VHS, and DVD, and fortunately we've been able to keep that. And as a person that really wasn't a history nut when I was in school or anything, I felt like you're saying, I just wish more people had saved it and wrote it down. And now I hear him as I got older, and I'm finding it extremely hard to keep people interested in preserving that history of small town USA.
And of course that does happen, but it's because of people like you, and it's because of people like your friends that we were talking about earlier that are, financially, very generously financially supporting these organizations. Was it Lucy? Was that her name? Cindy Luce and her brother.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, but her brother.
Yeah,
Bill,
he passed away, and so she donated $5,000 here recently, and that was gracious of her.
So, and it's because of support like that we are able to keep this history alive and going, and it's also because of I would say our show too, to be able to give viewers reasons for when they're planning road trips, for places where they would want to stop, and history that is intriguing and interesting to them. And, we get people like you who have so much information that we almost kind of don't know where to start or where to stop. But, it's little things like that. And I guess on that note too, what's maybe like one gemstone of this town that I haven't asked you about yet, that maybe you haven't even told us about yet? And I don't know if that's a business. I don't know if that's like a family who came. Yep, I see it.
Now that you asked, and because many of my friends say I got too many stories.
Yes, you're loaded.
I liked antique automobiles.
Yes.
And Dad bought a 1930 Model A Ford about the year I graduated from high school, and he said, "Why don't you just drive it to college, Bob?" Well, that led me to later years getting me a 1934 Chevy, which I was going after a Corvette. But here's where I took it a ride one day out around Middletown. And I came up on the Hess Cemetery down by Caddis, another little town in Henry, not far from here. And I had never heard much about the Hess Cemetery. So the next day, I went to the Henry County Cemetery Commission, who was in a nonprofit, but it was sponsored by the county commissioners, but to restore cemeteries. And so I got introduced to them and some of the historians. It was about 20 people there, and one of them was preserving the stones. And I brought my pictures to show that the Hess, and then they said, "Well, Bob, we're going down to the Hess Cemetery on 9/11 day and restore it." And they had the volunteer fire department, and Henry County Highway gave us some sand and so forth, and the courier came out and shot pictures of the county commissioners. So it led me to restore several cemeteries, which I have found abandoned.
Right.
And one of them, again, is the Showwater Cemetery out here by Shenandoah School, and it was literally being tore up. And I went in there and tried to restore the whole thing, not finding anyone really caring or interested in it, but one person would give me a flag, and my neighbor was a sandblaster, and we got all the stones put back where they were, and we have photos of that. But that's something I joke with everybody, just cremate me and scatter me among the what's left. But I think it is sad. I even have one cemetery that's completely gone, and I have photos of it, but it's disappeared. I can't think of the name of it, but a gentleman named Bud Bush from Henry County was pushing that at the time when we built this building, and he kept tapping me on the shoulder, but I didn't. But later, I wish Bud was still here. But
well, I'm going to tap you on the shoulder right now and ask you one more thing about the building. In the back, I did see an automobile. We didn't talk about it though, and I didn't. So it's in that back room. What is that? Am I wrong?
The wheeled thing?
Yes, a wheeled thing. I was right. I looked at it really quick, and I didn't even get a chance to ask
automobile. That's the hose cart that was hand-pulled by the volunteer firemen.
Okay, that's what that is. Okay.
And Lee Woods and Raymond Hess, and I have their voices describing that.
Yeah.
They would pull that to the fires. There wasn't no pump trucks.
Okay, gotcha.
And they would have to use a hydrant wrench from the fire hydrants to put the fires out.
So
but
that's
they
what
kept
that
asking
is.
for horses. And that's an interesting story that just luckily I got it completely restored.
Because I didn't get a chance to take a good look at it.
Yeah.
Obviously, when we go back in, I will. Now, what's one other thing inside of the Historical Society that we haven't talked about yet? And I know I'm going to rack your brain on this one. I mean, there's a beautiful wedding dress in there. There's some memorabilia in there that caught my eye. And I'm just wondering if there's anything in the building that we haven't talked about yet that stands out to you as something special worth noting here.
That is a very hard question.
I know.
Because as everybody knows me, one story leads to another.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously...
Got to pick one thing, Bob.
One thing. Well, to me, the one, and I really didn't elaborate on it, but it's the large photos coming from the camera. I don't think there's any other town or community would have as many photos that we have indexed and copied from day one, and I'm talking about the 1870s and 1880s.
Yeah, you're right. A lot of towns don't have
some of the
that.
scenes we have in downtown Middletown, and that's what kept my interest, and that's the number one thing.
All right.
And there were other photographers besides my great grandfather, but that's how I got.
All right, Bob. I'm going to leave us with one more question. So, what is it? Now, we've got all these books in here. We've got all this treasured history. We've got pictures. Again, like you said, pictures that go way back that most other towns do not have until like the early 1900s, and you guys are going back several years before then. So what legacy are you wanting to leave behind?
Well, it's not my name. It's the history of your community. And I'm proud to be with you folks because I didn't know anybody was doing this. But I worry that our youth, and I was one of them, did not ask our grandparents or parents enough questions.
Right.
And I wish I'd asked more.
Yeah.
And so I think by recording it, at least we have a place to go do it. And as a friend just told me, you can put it all on the internet now and find it. But someone's got to come down and put it together, keep it going. And what we're not doing, and I wish more would do, is recent history, see.
Right.
We just had a new dentist move in town, and there's a story in the Middletown News this week, and I cut it out because, that's a story that needs to be told, dentistries. And we've had several over the years. It used to be a dentist right across the street. I had two dentists in my neighborhood where I lived, but who would remember that, One of them was Dr. Hammer, and the other one, I can't think of his name now, but I've got it somewhere.
So,
but yes,
so
we
that's
need
the
to ask
legacy.
more questions of our grandparents and parents
Yeah.
and record it, write it down.
Well, Bob, it's because of historians like you that we are able to be here, that we're able to talk about this history. A lot of towns, you're right, do not have this. We are very fortunate to come here. Our viewers are very fortunate to be able to take these rides with us, as oftentimes on the internet it is. And then sometimes we get people who love so much what they see that they do come to these towns, that they are interested. They share the enthusiasm. So, Bob, we thank you for being able to share your stories, all this interesting information with us, and just being able to be here and talking about what is important for the future. And of course, it is, it's the legacy of what was and what is and what will be.
I've been in all 50 states, including Alaska, and everywhere we go, we check up history. Mm-hmm. And I just thought I thought everybody did that, what I'm trying to say. But yes, I'm shocked to hear that you people are coming around, and I want to see more of Henry County, small town. And yes, our objective is to focus on our local history, because we know others will record the rest of them.
Yes, sir.
And
that's correct.
Appreciate you being here.
Yeah, well, Bob, you've been a delight to talk to you today. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you for watching another episode of History in Your Own Backyard here today in Middletown, Indiana. Bob Hess, thank you so much for having us out at the Historical Society.
I'm glad you folks are here, and as we've said, I hope you travel slowly and stop often.
Oh, you just took my line, Bob, but you know what? You did a great job with it. So thank you for watching another episode. Until next time, bye for now.